Okay, I'm going to start by saying that I have made about 25 different versions of this video, and I've not been happy with any of them. I am not clearly a small, big screen, social media screen actor, but I'm going to try this one more time. So this is take, I don't know, like 25 or something like that. Hello, my name is David Coley. You may recognize me from around the department if you're a major or a minor in English. I'm the undergraduate chair, and so you've probably gotten some emails from me from time to time that sort of check in or touch base or advertise awards and do those kind of things. When I am not being the undergraduate chair, I'm a medievalist, which means I study the literature of the 14th and the 15th century in England, particularly the works of the Pearl poet, the Gawain poet, Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, William Langland, and so forth. As a medievalist, I'm very seldom accused of being current with my work. I tend to write about a world as it existed or as I perceived it to exist about 650 years, 700 years ago. It's a very different time and a very different place than the one we live in now. And I'm surrounded by colleagues who do brilliant work with the contemporary world, but that's just not me. I don't do that kind of work. Or at least I didn't think I did. That was the case when I published this book, Death in the Pearl Maiden. It was published by Ohio State University Press, and it deals with the way in which the plague pandemic of the Middle Ages, the so-called Black Death, is indicated in some of the literature in one particular manuscript in 14th century England. When I published this book, a year ago, this seemed like it would be another book about the medieval world, and I didn't think it would have any relevance to the time that we live in now. And yet, I also didn't think that I would be sitting here making my 25th attempt at a video for you. I did not think that I would not be teaching in the classroom this semester. I didn't think that I wouldn't be able to go outside because we're in the midst of a pandemic and that I'd have to wear a mask when I went grocery shopping. None of these things did I expect, and none of these things did any of us expect, I suppose. But here we are. In any event, one of the things that I've heard a lot is a kind of comparison between the Black Death and COVID-19. And I want to push back against that a little bit. I am not suggesting that COVID-19, that the pandemic we're facing now isn't bad. It's very bad. And it is going to have political and social and economic ramifications that we're going to be sort of trying to figure out for years. But at the same time, the Black Death was, by almost every metric, appreciably worse. The mortality rate of the Black Death was upwards of 50% in Europe. So it killed over the course of about 6 years about half of the continent's population. And it kept coming back. The first outbreak was in 1347, 1348 in England, but there was another outbreak in 1361. There was another one in 1372, another in 1378. And so this, for medieval people, was a kind of recurring horror. It was a recurring trauma. It kept coming back over and over and over again. And they did not have the understandings that we do of medical science. They didn't have the kind of treatments that we currently offer. So to say that COVID-19 is the Black Death is not true. It is not the Black Death. There are ways in which it's similar. It is a pandemic. It is killing people, and it is affecting many, many people and their families. But it is not the same thing, and I think it's just worth noting that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is my book, because one of the things that I find so interesting about the pandemic of the Black Death is the way that it was represented in the literature of its own time, or to be precise, the way that it wasn't represented in the literature of its own time. One of the things that English writers are sometimes accused of in the 14th century is ignoring the Black Death. As though they've somehow failed. This doesn't happen in other places in Europe. In Italy, you have the brilliant writings of Giovanni Boccaccio, who discusses the way that the plague moved through Florence like a grease-fed fire, and he talks about people sort of dying in the streets. He talks about how Florentine citizens, some of them became very, very religious and ascetic and tried to atone for their sins, and then others just sort of ate and drank and had sex and just lived their lives because the world was ending, and so why not? The French writer Guillaume de Machaut talks about the way that plague moved through Paris like a like a hungry beast that would devour everything that it could and could not be satisfied. But in England, we don't get these kinds of descriptions of the plague. We have references in Geoffrey Chaucer to the death. And William Langland talks about pocus and pestilences, that muche papal shent in Piers Plowman. But there's really no comparison between the literature from the continent in terms of the way that it deals with the plague and the literature from England from the 14th century and the way that it deals with the plague. Later English poetry from the 15th and the 16th centuries, that would start to deal with the Black Death or the other plague outbreaks in much more sort of overt ways. But in the 14th century, it just didn't seem to be happening. And this is sort of the problem that I try to unpack in this book. And I try to figure out why this distinction exists. In order to do that, I take a look at 4 poems that are bound together in a single manuscript: Pearl, Patience, Cleanness, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. None of these poems even mentions the Black Death, even in the kind of hesitant ways that Chaucer and Langland do. And in my book, I argue that you can perceive, or that we can perceive, the pandemic in those texts, even though it's not overtly discussed. That you can see it in patterns of wordplay, you can see it in images that are used in the poems, you can see it in certain biblical references, in certain social references. What I argue, in short, is that the plague was always sort of embedded in those poems, and that perhaps it was also embedded in 14th century English literature as a whole. That's the thesis. That's what I try to suss out in this book. But right now, I'm stuck in my house, right? And I'm starting to see things a little bit differently. And I'm coming to respect, in ways that I hadn't before, sort of the sheer effort or the kind of force of will that must have gone into these works during a time of pandemic. We tend to think, again, the critics have sort of talked about the failure of English literature to deal with the plague in the 14th century, and sort of the failure of Chaucer. You know, Chaucer was afraid of it, or timid, or that his references were scant. So we tend to think about the sort of failure of works to engage with the Black Death. And while Chaucer was working on the Canterbury Tales, while Gower was writing the Confessio Amantis, there were outbreaks of plague. The Black Death itself, the first major outbreak, had already passed, and these are writers that were working in its aftermath. But there were certainly local outbreaks that would have affected them personally, and that would have affected them and the world that they inhabited. I'm sitting here in my apartment in the middle of a global pandemic, and I'm barely able to force myself to make coffee in the morning, or to get to my 3rd Zoom meeting of the day, or to edit a 3-page book review for a scholarly journal, let alone pump out, epic-making poetry that may or may not engage with the Black Death. So, who am I to suggest that there was a failure to deal with the Black Death in the poetry of the 14th century, when I can't even get to my, morning Skype or something like that. Anyway, I wish there were a straighter line between what I discuss in Death and the Pearl Maiden and the moment that we find ourselves in now. I wish there were some kind of nugget of wisdom that I could share from my work that would make sense of, or offer comfort or solace in this moment of pronounced crisis in our own world. I wish that my research could give hope. I have colleagues that I think, do work, and people read it and they're like, wow, this is inspiring for the world we live in now. And I never get the sense that people read my work and think about it in those ways. My work focuses on sort of death and the grim ramifications of trauma. But if there is a passage in here that is hopeful, I think I have located it at the very end of the very last chapter. And so here it is. In this respect, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight might be seen as tacitly, again, this is hope, but it is really contingent. I'm sorry, guys. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight might be seen as tacitly acknowledging the epic scope of the pestilential trauma that England faced, as well as the social and cultural change, both positive and negative, that such widespread trauma precipitated. And perhaps more simply, the poem also affirms for its audience that after Troy, after Camelot, and even after the Black Death itself, history does not come to an end. History does not come to an end. I'm sorry that y'all are stuck in your houses. I'm sorry that I'm stuck in my house, and I hope that you're staying safe. I hope that you're staying healthy. Keep reading, keep enjoying what you can enjoy in these times and do what you've got to do to get yourselves through it, and be safe out there, and take care. That's it. Take 25 is over. Have a good weekend.